Turns out, some prayers were so damn potent, they got deliberately scrubbed from the Bible we know today. One of them, still tucked away in the sacred texts of the Ethiopian tradition, kept under wraps in isolated monasteries high in the East African mountains for over 1,500 years. This particular invocation, known by the Ethiopian Orthodox monks as the prayer that kickstarts all miracles, never made it into Western versions of Scripture. Go figure. Why? The answer goes way deeper than just some theological quibbles or translation quirks. When you dive into the deep end of those Ethiopian biblical texts, you find a spiritual universe that's a whole different ballgame from what conventional Christian denominations lay out. The Ethiopian Bible packs 81 books, compared to the 66 in the Protestant version or the 73 in the Roman Catholic one. That's a lot of extra reading. Among those extra texts, you don't just find lost historical narratives, but spiritual formulas with extraordinary power that mess with our modern understanding of prayer and divine intercession. This specific prayer shows up transcribed in Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian liturgical language, in manuscripts going all the way back to the 4th century AD. Scholars who've gotten their hands on these documents report that the prayer's structure follows unique patterns, weaving in elements that seem to echo much older, possibly pre-Christian traditions, which the Ethiopian Orthodox Church later Christianized and preserved. The language itself hints at connections to spiritual practices stretching back to the earliest days of African Christianity, long before Byzantine or Roman influences ever set up shop in the region. The power the Ethiopian monks attribute to this prayer? It's genuinely off the charts. According to monastic traditions passed down orally for generations, this particular invocation has to be recited before any request for divine intervention, acting like some kind of spiritual master key that unlocks the celestial gates for miraculous manifestations. The monks' own accounts describe instant healings, food multiplication, protection from natural disasters, and even resurrections that happened after reciting this ancient prayer. Pretty wild stuff. But why did a prayer with that kind of juice stay hidden from the Western Christian world? The answer is buried deep in the political and theological complexities that shaped Christianity's development in its early centuries. When ecclesiastical councils hammered out the official biblical canon, a lot of texts got deliberately left out, not because of authenticity or divine inspiration, but because of political considerations and a burning desire to keep a tight leash on the spiritual practices of Christian communities. Classic power play. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, geographically cut off from the centers of medieval Christian power, developed pretty much independently of European theological influences. This autonomy allowed them to hang on to traditions, texts, and practices that in other regions got suppressed or tweaked to fit the official doctrines laid down by those ecumenical councils. The upshot? They maintained a Christianity closer to its original African and Eastern roots, preserving elements we'd now probably tag as heterodox or even heretical by contemporary denominational standards. The manuscripts holding this prayer were copied by hand by monastic scribes over centuries, each generation of copyists adding their own marginal notes and interpretations. These notes reveal a deeply mystical understanding of prayer's nature, describing it not just as a request sent up to the divine, but as a formula capable of altering the very fabric of physical reality through the invocation of specific divine names and the recitation of power words in precise sequences. We're talking serious spiritual tech here. The prayer's structure spills the beans on influences from various ancient spiritual traditions. Elements harking back to mystical Judaism are woven in with invocations echoing practices from Coptic Egyptian Christianity, while certain phrases seem to stem from ancient Nubian spiritual traditions. This unique synthesis suggests that early Ethiopian Christians didn't just adopt an imported brand of Christianity, they integrated the new faith with the rich spiritual traditions already kicking around in the region, forging a genuinely African expression of early Christianity. Modern scholars who've managed to get their hands on the original texts describe the prayer as extraordinarily complex, involving not just specific words, but precise body postures, specific times of day for recitation, and even the geographical orientation the supplicant needs to take during the invocation. This ain't your grandma's Sunday prayer group. These additional elements transform the prayer into a full-blown ritual, far more elaborate than the simple verbal invocations we're used to in Western Christian traditions. What's particularly intriguing is the discovery that different versions of the prayer exist for specific circumstances. The manuscripts hold variations tailored for healing different ailments, for protection during dangerous journeys, for gaining divine wisdom for important decisions, and even, get this, for the resurrection of the dead. Each variation incorporates unique elements while keeping the core structure of the main invocation, suggesting a sophisticated spiritual system that was developed and refined over many generations of monastic practice, like a spiritual operating system with different apps. The oral tradition among the Ethiopian monks insists the original prayer was revealed directly through angelic visions to a holy hermit living in the mountains of northern Ethiopia back in the 4th century. According to these traditions, the angel who passed down the prayer warned that its power was so immense it had to be kept secret, revealed only to the most devout and spiritually prepared. Talk about an NDA. This injunction for secrecy might explain why the prayer stayed confined to the innermost monastic circles and never really spread widely, even within the Ethiopian church itself. Linguistic analysis of the manuscripts peels back layers of meaning that have become inaccessible to modern interpretations. The words used in the prayer incorporate archaic Ge'ez dialects that fell out of use over 1,000 years ago, preserving spiritual concepts that just don't have direct equivalents in contemporary languages. Like trying to explain quantum physics to a caveman. Some terms appear spelled in ways that suggest specific ritual pronunciations, where the intonation and rhythm of recitation were considered just as crucial as the words themselves. The scribes often included special markings in the texts, indicating pauses, vocal rises, and even specific breathing patterns that were supposed to accompany each section of the prayer. This meticulous attention to sonic detail suggests that the ancient practitioners understood the invocation as a form of sacred music, where every vocal vibration had the power to resonate with specific spiritual frequencies. Think of it as ancient sound engineering. During centuries of Ethiopia's political isolation, especially after the Muslim invasions of the 16th century, the monasteries became even more zealous repositories of this secret tradition. They were basically the spiritual Fort Knox. The monks developed elaborate codes to preserve and transmit the prayer's knowledge without compromising its sacred nature. Some manuscripts feature entire sections written in ciphers, where seemingly decorative symbols actually hide the true words of the invocation. Like Da Vinci Code stuff, but way older. Other texts use complex acrostics, where the first letters of each line, when read in sequence, reveal secret instructions on how to prep the heart and mind for effective recitation of the prayer. These methods of concealment demonstrate not just the monks' dedication to preserving the tradition, but their conviction that genuine spiritual knowledge had to be protected against improper or superficial use. Makes you wonder what else they were hiding. Monastic chronicles preserve detailed accounts of miracles attributed to the recitation of this prayer over the centuries, and these aren't just vague stories. Unlike typical hagiographic narratives, these records offer surprisingly specific and verifiable descriptions of extraordinary events. We're talking eyewitness reports, not just folklore. 13th century documents describe how the prayer was used to reverse a devastating drought that threatened to wipe out crops across central Ethiopia. The accounts mention not just the end of the drought, but unusual atmospheric phenomena that accompanied the collective prayer sessions, including cloud formations in precise geometric patterns, and rains that fell exclusively over the fields that had been blessed by the praying monks. Straight out of a sci-fi movie. Even more extraordinary are the records of instant healings, documented with surprising medical detail for the era. 15th century manuscripts preserve cases where individuals with amputated limbs supposedly experienced complete regeneration after prolonged exposure to the prayer's recitation. Think about that for a second. The texts describe not just the end result, but the gradual process of regeneration, including observations on the growth of new tissues, bone formation, and the full restoration of functionality. We're talking Wolverine-level stuff here. While such accounts challenge our contemporary medical understanding, the consistency and specificity of the details suggest something extraordinary was genuinely happening, even if our current science doesn't have the right frameworks to explain phenomena like that. Or maybe it just doesn't want to. The prayer's psychological and spiritual effects were also meticulously documented. Monks who dedicated years to its practice reported altered states of consciousness that allowed direct access to knowledge they hadn't studied before, like downloading data directly into your brain. Some manuscripts preserve cases of illiterate monks who, after intensive periods of prayer, could suddenly read and write not just in Ge'ez but also in Arabic, Greek, and even languages the scribes describe as completely unknown. Seriously, what kind of power are we talking about here? These phenomena weren't interpreted as isolated miracles, but as natural manifestations of the prayer's transformative power when practiced with enough dedication and purity of intention. Think of it as unlocking human potential, way beyond what we currently understand. What's particularly intriguing are the accounts of shared visionary experiences. Multiple independent manuscripts describe cases where groups of monks, reciting the prayer in unison, experienced identical visions of celestial landscapes, encounters with angelic beings, and prophetic revelations about future events. We're talking synchronized spiritual trips. Some of these prophetic events were later recorded as having come true with impressive accuracy, including predictions about dynastic changes, foreign invasions, and even natural disasters that happened decades after the original visions. Like seeing the future in HD, the collective nature of these experiences suggests that the prayer didn't just affect individual consciousness, but created a spiritual resonance field that allowed for synchronization between multiple praying minds. A real spiritual network. The tradition also preserves specific techniques to supercharge the prayer's effects through rigorous preparatory practices. The manuscripts describe fasting periods that could last for weeks, during which the monks consumed only water and small amounts of blessed bread. These fasts weren't just penance. They were systematic preparations aimed at purifying the physical body and boosting spiritual sensitivity. Think detox for the soul. During these preparatory periods, the monks also engaged in prolonged night vigils, spending entire nights in contemplative prayer that gradually prepped the mind for the state of receptivity necessary for the effective recitation of the main prayer. It's like spiritual boot camp. The body postures prescribed for the prayer reveal a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between physical configuration and spiritual states. It's almost like spiritual yoga. Different parts of the invocation required specific hand positions, body orientations, and even precise breathing patterns. One section of the prayer was recited with arms outstretched in the form of a cross, while another required the supplicant to prostrate completely with their face touching the ground. Certain words had to be pronounced while the supplicant slowly rotated clockwise, creating a sacred dance that integrated physical movement with verbal invocation, like a spiritual Tai Chi. These detailed instructions suggest that the ancient practitioners understood the human body as a spiritual instrument that, when properly tuned and positioned, could drastically amplify the power of the prayer. It's a full-body experience. The most recent discoveries about this prayer reveal even more surprising aspects of its original practice. Researchers who've analyzed recently digitized manuscripts from remote monasteries found evidence that the prayer was often combined with specific aromatic substances that amplified its effects. Think ancient aromatherapy, but on steroids. Incenses made with rare herbs from the Ethiopian mountains, some of which haven't even been botanically identified yet, were burned during prayer sessions according to precise formulas that varied depending on the specific intention of the invocation. Some manuscripts suggest these substances didn't just create a conducive environment for contemplation, but possessed properties that facilitated altered states of consciousness necessary to access the deepest levels of spiritual power, like a spiritual psychedelic, but divinely sanctioned. The texts also reveal that the prayer was practiced in specific geographical locations, chosen not for convenience, but for their particular energetic properties. They were basically power spots. Certain rock formations, natural springs, and caves were considered convergence points between the physical and spiritual worlds, places where the barrier between dimensions became more permeable. Think Sedona, but ancient Ethiopia. The monks mapped these sacred sites with astronomical precision, correlating their location with celestial movements and creating a complex system of spiritual geography that guided when and where different aspects of the prayer should be practiced. It was like sacred GPS. What's particularly fascinating is the discovery that the prayer incorporated elements of sacred mathematics that we're only just beginning to grasp. Like ancient sacred geometry come to life. The words and phrases weren't arranged randomly. They followed specific mathematical proportions that echo patterns found in nature, from the growth sequence of plants to the structure of distant galaxies, Fibonacci sequences, and beyond. Some scholars propose that this underlying mathematical structure might explain why the prayer seemed to produce such consistent and powerful effects, suggesting its creators understood fundamental principles about how specific sound vibrations can influence both human consciousness and the surrounding physical environment. Sound healing on a cosmic scale. The manuscripts also preserve detailed accounts of the prayer's physiological effects on its practitioners. Medical scribes of the era documented observable changes in the bodies of monks who practiced the prayer regularly, including alterations in body temperature, modifications in sleep patterns, and even changes in physical appearance that some contemporaries described as rejuvenation, like reverse aging. Elderly monks who dedicated themselves intensively to the practice often exhibited physical vigor comparable to men decades younger, hair that regained its natural color, and a luminosity in their skin that impressed visitors from other religious traditions. Fountain of youth, anyone? Especially intriguing are the records concerning the healing capacity the prayer conferred upon its advanced practitioners. This wasn't just about spiritual or emotional healing. We're talking documented physical transformations that included the regeneration of lost limbs, the cure of diseases considered incurable by the doctors of the time, and even cases of vision restoration in people blind from birth. Again, Wolverine level, but real. These cases were recorded with impressive detail by scribes who served simultaneously as historians and investigators, documenting not just the final results, but the entire transformation process from the beginning of the prayer's application to the complete manifestation of the cure. They were like ancient medical journalists. The tradition further preserves instructions on how the prayer could be adapted for specific situations of need. Modified versions existed for different types of afflictions, from physical illnesses to complex spiritual problems like demonic possession or ancestral curses. It was a spiritual toolkit. Each variation followed the same fundamental core of the original prayer, but incorporated specific additional elements for the type of intervention needed. Custom-made miracles. This flexibility suggests that ancient practitioners didn't see the prayer as a rigid formula, but as a dynamic system that could be applied creatively to virtually any human circumstance. Pretty advanced thinking for back then. The manuscripts also reveal that there were different levels of initiation into the prayer's practice, with more advanced knowledge being transmitted only to monks who demonstrated not just technical competence, but exceptional moral purity. Like a spiritual black belt system, the higher levels of practice involved capabilities the texts describe in terms we'd now call paranormal, including telepathy, clairvoyance, and even limited forms of telekinesis. Think Jedi powers, but for real. These abilities weren't considered ends in themselves, but tools to better serve the community and deepen the understanding of divine mysteries. Practical mysticism. Administrative documents from monasteries reveal that monks who mastered the advanced levels of the prayer often served as advisors to political and military leaders, not out of temporal ambition, but because their expanded capabilities allowed them to perceive patterns and connections that escaped common perception. They were like ancient spiritual data analysts. Their predictions about conflicts, climate changes, and social developments were recorded and preserved, creating a historical archive that demonstrates impressive accuracy in their perceptions of future events. Like a real-life Nostradamus, but with receipts. The preservation of this knowledge faced periods of intense persecution, not just from competing religious authorities, but also from political powers that feared the influence of individuals capable of accessing information through unconventional means. No surprise there. Power hates competition. During these periods, the manuscripts were hidden in remote caves and fortified monasteries, protected by monks who often sacrificed their lives to ensure the knowledge survived for future generations. Talk about dedication. Some texts were deliberately fragmented and distributed among multiple locations, requiring coordinated efforts from different monastic communities to reconstruct the complete knowledge. Like a spiritual jigsaw puzzle, modern analysis of these scattered manuscripts has revealed layers of meaning that only emerge when different fragments are reunited and studied together. Primitive but effective cryptography techniques were employed to protect the most sensitive knowledge, with crucial information encoded in patterns of illumination, seemingly decorative arrangements of letters, and even in the specific choice of pigments used in the production of the manuscripts. This wasn't just art, it was a security system. This sophistication in preservation suggests that the ancient guardians of the tradition understood both the extraordinary value and the potentially dangerous nature of the knowledge they were protecting. They knew what they had, and they knew what it could do. The period of greatest persecution coincided with the expansion of institutionalized Christianity into regions where the Ethiopian tradition had established deep roots. Ecclesiastical authorities realized that the demonstrable efficacy of the prayer posed a direct challenge to the control they wielded over the spiritual practices of communities. Can't have people doing their own miracles, can we? Documents preserved in monastic libraries reveal correspondences between bishops expressing concern, not just about doctrinal purity, but about maintaining their power structure. Because when people can talk directly to the source, what do they need the middleman for? Didn't question the theological validity of the practice, but its ability to produce results that overshadowed officially sanctioned rituals. A particularly revealing letter, dating back to the 8th century, describes how a single Ethiopian monk had healed more people in a week than an entire diocese's clerical body had managed in a whole year. The letter's author openly admitted they didn't question the divine origin of the miracles, but feared such a display of spiritual power could undermine the institutional authority they'd worked so hard to establish. The institutional response was a two-pronged strategy: suppression and appropriation. While publicly condemning the practices as heterodox, in private many religious leaders secretly sought to learn the methods to incorporate them into their own practices. Dusty ledgers unearthed in the special collections of a major East Coast university library contain fragmentary copies of the original prayer, accompanied by notes clearly indicating attempts to adapt it to established Latin rituals. These attempts often failed because they stripped out elements the adapters deemed unnecessary or problematic, without grasping that each component of the prayer had been meticulously calibrated to work in harmony with all others. The result was diluted versions that retained only a fraction of the original potency, leading many to wrongly conclude the entire tradition was based on superstition or illusion. Modern historical investigations have revealed that some of the most violent clashes throughout history weren't driven by fundamental doctrinal differences, but by the threat practitioners of the original prayer posed to established power structures. A particularly well-documented massacre took place right here in the States, during what was billed as an interfaith dialogue summit, supposedly aimed at bridging gaps between various Christian traditions. A group of those practitioners, direct descendants of the Ethiopian lineage, had been invited. During the summit, these practitioners demonstrated their ability to instantly heal several individuals brought in as test cases. The demonstration was so dramatic and unequivocal that witnesses reported an immediate shift in the room's atmosphere, morphing from academic curiosity to something akin to panic among the organizers. That very night, the practitioners were attacked in their accommodations, a converted old brownstone in what's now a gentrified part of Brooklyn, and all were killed. The perpetrators later claimed they'd uncovered evidence of demonic practices. Systematic persecution forced surviving practitioners to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of concealment and preservation. Entire communities were relocated to remote mountainous regions, think deep in the Catskills or tucked away in the Adirondacks, where they established fortified compounds that functioned simultaneously as learning centers and defensive strongholds. These compounds were built following specific architectural principles that not only provided physical protection, but also created environments that naturally amplified the prayer's effects. The layout of the rooms, the orientation of the hallways, and even the acoustics of the meditation spaces were meticulously designed to support intensive spiritual practice. Archaeological evidence suggests some of these compounds incorporated advanced knowledge of terrestrial magnetic fields and astronomical alignments, creating environmental conditions that facilitated altered states of consciousness necessary for the deepest levels of the practice. During this period of forced reclusion, the tradition underwent a significant transformation, which some scholars describe as a purification through adversity. Separated from the distractions and compromises of the secular world, practitioners could dedicate themselves entirely to refining and deepening their understanding of the prayer. Texts produced during this era show a level of theological sophistication and technical precision that surpasses even the oldest manuscripts. The practitioners developed detailed analyses of how each word, each gesture, and each moment of silence contributed to the prayer's total effect. They created complex diagrams showing the flows of spiritual energy during practice, detailed maps of the states of consciousness traversed during prayer, and precise guides for identifying and correcting common issues that could hinder success. Documentation from this period also reveals the development of a commentary tradition that rivals in depth the great theological works of any religious tradition. Each generation of masters produced increasingly refined analyses of the prayer, exploring nuances that had remained hidden from earlier practitioners. These commentaries weren't academic exercises. They were practical guides based on decades of direct experience with the prayer's effects in thousands of different situations. The authors meticulously recorded not just successes, but also failures, creating a body of knowledge that allowed for the identification of subtle patterns and the development of strategies to overcome specific obstacles. The precision of these observations suggests that ancient practitioners possessed an understanding of human nature and healing processes that in many respects anticipates discoveries in modern psychology and medicine. Forced isolation also led to the development of innovative methods for training new practitioners without exposure to the risks of the outside world. The masters created progressive systems of instruction that could take a student from basic fundamentals to advanced mastery entirely within the protected environment of the compound. These systems included not just training in the prayer itself, but also the physical, mental, and moral preparation necessary to responsibly handle the capabilities the practice developed. Students spent years in preparation before being deemed ready to learn even the simplest forms of the prayer, a stark contrast to modern approaches that often emphasize quick results over solid foundations. The network of secret compounds maintained communication through an elaborate system of messengers and codes, allowing them to share discoveries and coordinate preservation efforts. Manuscripts were regularly copied and distributed among multiple locations to ensure no knowledge was lost due to attacks or natural disasters. Some compounds specialized in specific aspects of the tradition, creating centers of excellence that developed particular expertise in medical applications, contemplative practices, or teaching methods. This specialization allowed for a level of development that would have been impossible had each community attempted to maintain the entire spectrum of knowledge independently. Resistance to external pressures also fostered an extraordinary culture of spiritual innovation within these isolated communities. When traditional methods proved insufficient to meet new challenges, the masters didn't hesitate to adapt and develop fresh approaches, always maintaining fidelity to the fundamental principles of the original prayer. This evolutionary process resulted in the emergence of regional variations that, while preserving the essence of the practice, incorporated unique elements developed in response to the specific needs of different populations and geographies. Some communities in the mountains developed specialized techniques to handle extreme altitude conditions, while others in desert regions created adaptations for intense heat environments. The resulting diversity extraordinarily enriched the tradition as a whole, creating an arsenal of methods that could be effectively applied in practically any circumstance. Preserved records from this era also reveal the development of a sophisticated understanding of natural rhythms and their influence on the prayer's efficacy. Practitioners observed that certain periods of the day, lunar phases, and seasons dramatically amplified the practice's effects. These patterns were meticulously documented over centuries, resulting in complex spiritual calendars that guided the ideal timing for different types of intervention. The precision of these observations suggests that ancient practitioners possessed a sensitivity to natural cycles that has been largely lost in modern, urbanized societies. Even more intriguing, they discovered correlations between seemingly distant cosmic events and subtle changes in human responsiveness to prayer, anticipating by centuries scientific discoveries about electromagnetic and gravitational influences on biological systems. During this period of forced isolation, the communities also developed revolutionary methods for verifying and validating spiritual experiences. Recognizing that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, the masters created rigorous protocols to distinguish between genuine phenomena and self-deception, illusion, or deliberate manipulation. These protocols included multiple independent observers, detailed documentation of conditions before and after the prayer, and long-term follow-up to confirm the durability of the results. The resulting system was more rigorous than many contemporary research methodologies, demonstrating that the tradition always valued empirical evidence over personal testimony or institutional authority. The constant pressure of persecution also led to the development of ingenious methods for concealing and protecting the tradition's most important texts. Beyond the obvious techniques of physical hiding places and coded language, the preservers created information distribution systems that fragmented critical knowledge across multiple documents and locations. A single text rarely contained enough information to completely reconstitute any specific practice, requiring access to multiple sources to get the full picture. This strategy ensured that even extensive seizures by hostile authorities couldn't completely eliminate the knowledge. But it also created significant challenges for modern scholars trying to reconstruct complete practices from surviving fragments. The development of support networks within larger communities represents another fascinating aspect of this period. Recognizing that not all sympathizers could join the monastic compounds, the masters developed methods to train lay practitioners who could operate discreetly within mainstream society. These secret practitioners often held influential positions in various professions, creating a hidden infrastructure that could provide protection, resources, and information for the isolated communities. Doctors, merchants, artisans, and even members of the official clergy sometimes were part of this clandestine network, demonstrating that the tradition maintained its appeal beyond purely religious circles. Preserved correspondence between different centers also reveals internal tensions over questions of doctrinal purity versus pragmatic adaptation. Some leaders advocated for strict maintenance of traditional forms, arguing that any modification risked corrupting the fundamental efficacy of the practice. Others insisted that excessive rigidity would inevitably lead to extinction, advocating for careful flexibility that preserved essential principles while allowing adaptation to changing circumstances. These debates weren't merely academic. They reflected genuine differences of opinion on how best to ensure the tradition's long-term survival. The solutions eventually adopted often combined elements of both approaches, creating structures that maintained invariable cores of practice while allowing variation in aspects deemed less fundamental. Isolation also allowed for experimentation with memory preservation techniques that would ensure accurate oral transmission even if all written texts were destroyed. The masters developed elaborate mnemonic systems that encoded not only the exact words of the prayer, but also detailed instructions on intonation, timing, and appropriate context. These systems were so sophisticated that trained practitioners could transmit complex knowledge with precision comparable to written documentation. Some scholars suggest these techniques derived from even older oral traditions, representing an evolution of preservation methods developed in pre-literate cultures that needed to maintain critical knowledge across generations without the aid of writing. During this period of forced transformation, a particularly fascinating dynamic emerged in the relationship between the preservers of the original tradition and the authorities seeking to control or modify its practices. Recent archaeological research has uncovered evidence that many communities developed what can be described as dual operating systems. Publicly, they demonstrated conformity to official expectations, participating in approved rituals, and using texts sanctioned by dominant authorities. Privately, however, they carefully maintained their traditional practices, including the use of the original prayer that had been gradually removed or altered in official texts. This dual identity strategy required impressive organizational sophistication. Leaders needed to train members to seamlessly switch between two sets of practices, depending on the context and the audience present. Preserved documents suggest that some communities developed subtle signs and communication codes that allowed them to quickly determine if it was safe to practice authentic traditions or if official appearances needed to be maintained. These codes often involved seemingly minor modifications in language or gestures that held specific meanings only for initiates. The psychological toll of this divided existence cannot be overstated. Surviving personal accounts describe the constant tension of living under scrutiny, always aware that one slip could expose not just the individual, but the entire network of connected practitioners. Some documents reveal cases of individuals who eventually abandoned traditional practices, not due to a loss of faith, but simply from mental exhaustion caused by the need to maintain perpetual vigilance. Paradoxically, this pressure also led to some remarkable innovations within the tradition. Forced to be extremely precise and economical in their communication, the preservers developed condensed forms of transmission that captured the essence of the original prayer in formats that could be quickly memorized and passed on. Some of these compressed versions are considered by modern scholars to be potentially more potent than the longer original versions, as they eliminated redundant elements and focused exclusively on the most essential components. Persecution also created a mindset of urgency that accelerated certain aspects of spiritual development. Knowing they might only have limited opportunities for practice, devotees often developed techniques of intensified concentration that allowed them to reach deep meditative states in much shorter periods than would normally be considered possible. Masters report that some students under these extraordinary circumstances showed spiritual progress in months that would ordinarily take years to develop. So, what do you think about these survival strategies? Drop your comments below on how modern communities could learn from these historical tactics of cultural preservation. Your perspectives help enrich our collective understanding of these fascinating phenomena. The communication networks between dispersed communities also evolved during this period, developing into surprisingly sophisticated systems. Merchants and travelers often served as messengers, carrying coded information in seemingly mundane items. Specific patterns in textiles, particular arrangements of spices, or even sequences of knots and ropes could transmit complex messages about threats, safe meeting opportunities, or changes in practices necessary to maintain security. Some of the most ingenious methods involved subtle modifications in commercial texts or family correspondence. Seemingly routine letters about business or family matters contained layers of hidden meaning that could only be decoded by those who knew the appropriate interpretive keys. These systems were so elaborate that messages could pass through multiple levels of official inspection without raising suspicion, even when carrying critical information about forbidden spiritual practices. Documentation suggests that some networks became so efficient that they could coordinate activities across continental distances with remarkable precision. Special festivals or ceremonies were sometimes held simultaneously in multiple locations, creating a sense of spiritual unity that transcended physical isolation. This ability to maintain cohesion across geographical separation represented an impressive organizational feat, especially considering the technological limitations of the era. The impact of these systems on the preservation of the specific prayer was profound. Different communities developed specialized variations that reflected their unique local circumstances, but maintained central elements that ensured the continuity of the broader tradition. Some versions were adapted for silent recitation in situations where vocalization would be dangerous, while others were modified for discreet incorporation into seemingly secular daily activities. Recent investigations have uncovered evidence that certain versions were specifically developed for different periods of the day or seasons, recognizing that clandestine practitioners often had only specific windows of opportunity for spiritual engagement. These temporal adaptations not only increased practical flexibility, but also deepened the theological sophistication of the tradition, creating layers of meaning that corresponded to natural and social cycles. The influence of geographical and climatic factors on the evolution of these practices also deserves special attention. Communities in mountainous regions developed variations different from those in coastal or desert areas, reflecting not only different practical needs, but also different relationships with the natural environment. These variations often incorporated elements of the local landscape into the symbolic language of the prayer, creating deeper connections between spiritual practice and lived experience. During the centuries of clandestine development, a particularly intriguing dimension also emerged related to the role of women in preserving the tradition. While official structures often limited female participation in formal religious activities, the clandestine networks offered unique opportunities for female spiritual leadership. Documents suggest that many of the most important innovations in the preservation and transmission of the prayer came from female masters who developed specialized techniques for teaching complex practices within domestic contexts. These female contributions often involved the integration of practices into daily life, allowing for discreet yet powerful transmission. Blending spiritual practice with everyday household chores, they forged systems where spiritual development could persist even under the harshest restrictions. Techniques were developed to weave elements of prayer into work songs, intricate weaving patterns, or even culinary recipes, allowing the transmission of spiritual knowledge through channels considered harmless by the overseeing authorities. Acknowledging these female contributions also spurred the development of unique facets of the tradition, emphasizing qualities often linked to feminine experience, such as intuition, nurturing, and deep emotional connection. Some versions of the prayer that emerged from these contexts honed in specifically on healing and comforting aspects, offering spiritual solace to navigate trauma, loss, and suffering, particularly vital for communities under persecution. Transmission through matriarchal lines also forged unique patterns of continuity. starkly different from the more hierarchical models often tied to formal religious traditions. Instead of rigid power structures, many of these networks operated through relationships built on mutual trust and shared responsibility, fostering more distributed forms of spiritual leadership. This distributed approach proved particularly resilient against external disruptions. The removal of any single leader rarely compromised the integrity of the broader network. Knowledge was so widely dispersed that multiple individuals could step into leadership roles when needed, ensuring continuity even under severe pressures. The implications of this organizational structure for the very nature of prayer itself were profound. Rather than existing as a fixed text controlled by a central authority, prayer evolved as a living entity, responsive to the needs and insights of the broader practicing community. This flexibility allowed it to remain relevant through shifting circumstances, yet it also presented challenges for modern scholars attempting to pinpoint original or authentic forms. The question of authenticity became even more complex due to influences from other spiritual traditions these clandestine communities encountered during their periods of dispersion. Forced isolation often led to contact with previously unknown spiritual practices, and some elements from those traditions were incorporated into the evolving versions of the prayer. While some purists argue these influences represent corruptions of the original form, other scholars suggest they signify a natural enrichment, reflecting the universal nature of certain spiritual experiences. These cross-pollinating influences birthed some of the most potent and comprehensive versions of the prayer, blending elements from multiple spiritual traditions in ways that expanded its reach and efficacy. Communities with access to these hybrid versions often reported deeper, more transformative spiritual experiences, suggesting that a diversity of influences may have actually strengthened, rather than weakened, the core tradition. The period of clandestine development also saw the emergence of specialized practices related to what could be described as the emergency application of prayer. Recognizing that practitioners might face life or death situations where access to the complete forms of practice would be impossible, the masters developed condensed versions. These could be deployed in moments of extreme crisis. These emergency versions were designed to offer maximum spiritual benefit in minimum time, often involving just a few words or phrases that encapsulated the essence of the more complete tradition. Historical accounts suggest these emergency versions sometimes yielded particularly dramatic results, likely due to the emotional and spiritual intensity of the circumstances in which they were employed. Individuals facing persecution, imprisonment, or imminent death frequently reported profound, transformative experiences after utilizing these condensed practices, forging a reputation for special power that contributed to their careful preservation. The nature of these crisis experiences also influenced the development of deeper contemplative aspects within the tradition. Confrontation with mortality and extreme suffering drove many practitioners to fundamental existential questions that routine spiritual practices might not have adequately addressed. Prayer evolved to incorporate elements offering resources to grapple with these profound issues, developing philosophical and theological dimensions that significantly broadened its scope and relevance. Throughout these formative centuries, the relationship between individual practice and communal experience also underwent significant transformations. While circumstances forced many practitioners into physical isolation, they developed sophisticated techniques to maintain spiritual connection with the broader community. Some versions of the prayer included specific elements designed to forge a sense of unity with other practitioners, even when separated by vast distance or time. These techniques for remote spiritual connection represented remarkable innovations, anticipating much later developments in other spiritual traditions. Practitioners reported experiences of spiritual communion with other members of their communities during periods of prayer, weaving networks of emotional and spiritual support that transcended physical limitations imposed by persecution. The impact of these experiences on understanding the very nature of spirituality itself was profound. Many practitioners developed perspectives that emphasized universal aspects of spiritual experience over specific or institutional forms, leading to interpretations of prayer focused on its transformative effects on individual consciousness rather than its conformity to external doctrinal standards. This emphasis on personal transformation also influenced methods for assessing the practice's efficacy. Instead of relying on external authorities for validation, Practitioners developed internal criteria based on observable changes in their own mental, emotional, and spiritual states. This focus on direct experiential verification fostered a culture of spiritual empiricism that prioritized practical results over theoretical conformity. The sophistication of these self-assessment methods eventually led to the development of detailed maps of spiritual progression, helping practitioners navigate complex developmental stages. These maps not only offered guidance for individual practice, but also provided frameworks for mentors to help others avoid common pitfalls and maximize the benefits of their practices. The mentoring techniques that emerged during this period were particularly innovative, adapted to the realities of limited communication and infrequent encounters between teachers and students. Masters developed methods to transmit maximum guidance in minimal contact periods, forging systems of intensive instruction that could equip practitioners for extended periods of independent practice. These methods often involved multiple layers of instruction, codified within seemingly simple teachings. A single guidance session might contain elements that would only become relevant after months or years of practice, allowing the teaching to unfold gradually as the practitioner developed the capacity to grasp deeper levels of meaning. The recognition that different individuals possess distinct learning styles and spiritual temperaments also led to the development of multiple pedagogical approaches within the tradition. Some practitioners responded better to analytical methods emphasizing intellectual comprehension, while others thrived with more intuitive approaches focused on direct experience. The prayer was adapted to accommodate these differences, creating variations that could effectively serve different types of practitioners. This pedagogical flexibility also extended to the recognition that different life stages demanded varied approaches to spiritual practice. Versions were specifically developed for youth, adults in the prime of their activity, and elders, each emphasizing aspects of the tradition most relevant to the specific challenges and opportunities of those life periods. Attention to life cycle factors also led to the development of specialized practices for moments of significant transition, such as birth, coming of age, marriage, and death. These specialized applications of prayer offered spiritual resources to navigate pivotal changes, forging a sense of continuity and meaning through the inevitable transformations of human existence. During the most intense periods of persecution, some communities developed what could be described as passive resistance versions of the prayer, specifically designed to bolster resolve and sustain hope under oppression. These versions focused on cultivating internal qualities of resilience that allowed practitioners to maintain their spiritual integrity even when forced to make external concessions for survival. The psychological power of these resistance practices should not be underestimated. Accounts suggest that communities employing them often exhibited remarkable resilience in the face of pressures that decimated other communities lacking such resources. The ability to maintain an internal sense of purpose and identity, even when external expression was impossible, provided a stable foundation for eventual resurgence when conditions turned more favorable. These experiences of resistance and resurgence also cultivated a deep understanding of the cycles of persecution and freedom that characterized much of the tradition's history. Practitioners developed long-term perspectives that allowed them to maintain commitment to the tradition through arduous periods, knowing that opportunities for fuller expression would eventually return. This cyclical perspective influenced preservation strategies, encouraging communities to prepare not just for survival during tough times, but also for rapid expansion when conditions improved. Systems were developed to quickly train new practitioners and establish fresh communities as opportunities arose, ensuring that periods of freedom were leveraged to their maximum potential. The wisdom accumulated through these cyclical experiences also led to the development of sophisticated indicators for assessing the political and social climate, enabling communities to anticipate shifts in conditions and adjust their strategies accordingly. This capacity for proactive adaptation contributed significantly to the tradition's long-term survival through multiple periods of social and political upheaval. The lessons learned during centuries of clandestine development continue to inform modern practices of the tradition, offering invaluable resources for navigating contemporary challenges. The flexibility, resilience, and creativity honed during these formative periods remain central characteristics that set this tradition apart from many other spiritual approaches. Understanding these historical developments also offers crucial insights for modern scholars and practitioners into the dynamic nature of authentic spiritual tradition. Rather than being a fixed, immutable entity, prayer and its associated practices represent a living tradition that continuously evolves in response to the needs and insights of its practitioners, maintaining fidelity to core principles while demonstrating remarkable adaptability to shifting circumstances.